Imagine a spring evening in 1841. The air is thick, sweet with jasmine, and heavy with river mud. Cicadas scream in the live oaks, like a warning no one heeds. Carriages roll up the long shell drive of the way they always do when something deliciously terrible has happened. Word has already spread from porch to porch, from Charleston drawing room to the remotest rice plantation. Silas Rutledge has lost his mind, or worse, he has done something unspeakable on purpose. The news arrives in fragments at first. A house servant overhears it in the kitchen and runs barefoot to the quarters. An overseer repeats it with a laugh that dies in his throat. A visiting cousin from Savannah spills it over brandy and is asked to leave the table. By nightfall, every white tongue in Colleton County is repeating the same impossible sentence. Silas Rutledge has given his daughter away, not in marriage, not to a suitor, to a slave, not as a nurse, not as a companion. He has signed papers, stood on his own veranda, and announced to 20 of the county's most powerful men that from the steps of Cypress Grove that from this day forward Catherine Elizabeth Rutledge, 28 years old, unmarried, white, and the sole heir to 800 acres is the legal and practical property of a 33-year-old black man named Ezekiel Cross. He used those exact words, complete and unquestioned authority over her person, her movements, her treatment, and her correction. The silence that followed, they say, was so complete you could hear the Combahee River breathing a mile away. Let that sink in for a moment. In a world where a white woman's reputation was guarded more fiercely than gold, where the mere rumor of impropriety could ruin an entire family for generations, Silas Rutledge stood in broad daylight and declared his own flesh and blood worth less than the man he had purchased for 403 days earlier. People did not know whether to faint, vomit, or reach for their dueling pistols. The women pressed handkerchiefs to their mouths and whispered, "Poor Catherine," while secretly thanking God it was not their daughter. Men who had shaken Silas's hand 100 times suddenly remembered urgent business elsewhere. Reverend Crenshaw, who had baptized Catherine as an infant, was seen leaving the plantation so quickly his horse threw a shoe. Judge Pelham, richest man in the county and rumored head of certain midnight societies, turned white as bleached bone and said nothing at all, which for him was louder than shouting, because everyone knew Catherine's condition. They had seen her at church years ago, before the curtains of Cypress Grove closed forever, once a pretty child, with dark ringlets, now a swollen, trembling recluse who sometimes screamed for hours behind shuttered windows. They had heard the stories, how she had attacked her father with a letter opener, how she tore her own dress to ribbons during fits, how no doctor from here to Philadelphia could cure her female hysteria. They pitied Silas, of course, a widower raising a mad daughter alone. A tragedy. But this was beyond tragedy. This was blasphemy carved in daylight. Within 48 hours, the scandal had a life of its own. Letters flew north and south. A Charleston newspaper printed a carefully vague paragraph that somehow made everything sound even worse. Mothers forbade their daughters from speaking Catherine's name, as if madness and disgrace might be contagious. Young bucks made crude jokes in taverns until older men shut them up with a look. And everywhere the same question hissed behind fans and over whiskey glasses: what kind of father does that to his own child? The cruel ones answered for him. They said Silas had finally snapped under the burden. They said Catherine's fits had grown so violent she was a danger to the household. They said the Negro, Ezekiel, knew roots and herbs African medicine, and Silas was desperate enough to try anything. But the cruel ones were lying to themselves, because even they felt the wrongness crawling under their skin like fever. There was something rehearsed about the whole thing. Silas had not wept. He had not stuttered. He had spoken calmly, almost proudly, as though announcing a new strain of rice. And when Marcus, Fanning wealthiest planter on the Ashepoo, dared to ask whether this was entirely proper, Silas only smiled a thin, grey smile and replied, "My daughter's health is worth more to me than your opinion, Marcus, or yours, Reverend, or any of yours." Then he raised his glass to the slave standing silently in the shadow of the veranda, tall, straight-backed, eyes lowered only because he chose to lower them, and said, "Ezekiel Cross now speaks for the Rutledge family in all matters concerning Miss Catherine." You could have heard a magnolia petal fall. That night bonfires were lit on half the plantations in the county, not for celebration, but so the overseers could stand watch. Men who had never locked their doors before now barred them. Women who had bragged about the loyalty of their people suddenly wondered what thought lived behind those silent black faces that cooked their food and raised their children. Because if Silas Rutledge, church elder, militia captain, man of property, could do this, what might the others be capable of when no one was watching? And beneath the fear, beneath the outrage, something else stirred. A delicious, shameful thrill. Because for all their horror, people could not stop talking about it. They rode for miles to catch a glimpse of the Rutledge place. They lingered at the crossroads store hoping for fresh gossip. They invented reasons to pass Cypress Grove at dusk, half hoping to see the unthinkable through the windows. They wanted to see Catherine broken. They wanted to see the slave who now owned a white woman's body and soul. But the shutters stayed closed, the house stayed quiet, and the cicadas kept screaming. No one saw Catherine leave her room anymore. No one saw Ezekiel cross, except as a shadow moving between the main house and the small cabin that had been built for him overnight, closer to the mistress's window than any slave cabin had ever stood before. People began to say the air around Cypress Grove felt different, heavy, watchful, like the river itself was holding its breath. Children were told never to play near the Rutledge gate. Field hands walked faster when they passed the property at twilight. Even the dogs refused to bark in that direction anymore. And still no one, not the gossips, not the preachers, not the powerful men who controlled every courthouse and pulpit for 100 miles, understood what had really been set in motion that day on the veranda. They thought they were witnessing the fall of one ambitious, broken family. They thought they were watching a desperate father sacrifice his daughter's reputation to save her life. They were wrong. They were watching the first move in a game that had been planned for years. A game of revenge so cold it had waited through grief, through chains, through an ocean of blood, for the perfect moment to begin. By November, the same people who had clutched their pearls in April would be ash and bone beneath blackened timbers. 13 of the county's most untouchable men would be dead. Cypress Grove Plantation would be a smoldering ruin, and the official story, a tragic house fire, would be accepted without question, because some truths are too terrible to speak aloud even when everyone already suspects them. But in April, none of that has happened yet. In April there is only silence, dread, and the growing certainty that something ancient and hungry has woken up on the Combahee River, something that began the moment Silas Rutledge looked a slave in the eye and said, "She is yours now," and smiled while he said it. So subscribe, turn on the bell, and walk with me back to that veranda in the dying light of a South Carolina spring, because what happened next in that house was never about healing. It was about justice, it was about memory, and it was about what a man and a woman are willing to become when the world decides their pain does not matter. 13 men would learn that lesson too late, and an entire county would spend the rest of its days trying to forget the night the harvest finally came home to roost. But that is still months away. For now, the only sound is the river breathing and the slow, deliberate footsteps of a man named Ezekiel Cross walking up the back stairs of a house that will soon burn like hell itself. Welcome to Cypress Grove. Leave the light on. You're going to need it. Drive south from Charleston on a road that forgets it's a road. The oaks close overhead until daylight feels like something borrowed. Spanish moss hangs in wet gray curtains, swaying though there is no wind. The air itself is thick, half water, half memory. When the smell of pluff mud and rotting jasmine finally claws its way into your lungs, you have arrived. At Cypress Grove Plantation, 800 acres of rice and blood pretending to be farmland. From the river, it looks almost beautiful. White columns, dark green shutters, galleries wrapped like wedding cake. A wide lawn rolling down to the slow brown Combahee, where alligators drift like logs with eyes. But step closer and the beauty sours. The paint is peeling in long, tired strips. The boxwoods are overgrown and sour-smelling. The silence is wrong, too few birds, too few voices, as though even the wind is afraid to speak too loudly here. This is Silas Rutledge's kingdom, and it is a kingdom built on wanting. Silas is tall the way a scarecrow is tall, thin, brittle, always leaning slightly forward as if the next rung on the ladder is just out of reach. His hair turned iron gray before he was 40, giving him the look of a severe schoolmaster who has never smiled at a child. He dresses well, but never richly. Everything about him says almost one of the great families, almost invited to the best tables in Charleston, almost powerful enough that his name alone can make a judge look away. 58 human beings wear his brand, 58 lives that wake before dawn, wade chest deep in malaria water, plant, weed, flood, harvest, thresh, until their fingers bleed into the grain that buys his silk waistcoats and his French brandy. It is enough to make him comfortable. It is nowhere near enough to make him feared. Silas married Elizabeth Yancey in 1812 for the same reason men marry land. She came with acreage and a bloodline that opened certain doors. Elizabeth was practical, sharp-eyed, kept the ledgers in perfect copperplate. She bled to death in the birthing bed 1 year later, leaving Silas a squalling infant daughter and a hunger that has never stopped gnawing. He named the child Catherine Elizabeth Rutledge, and then, for all practical purposes, forgot she was human. For 28 years, Catherine has lived in the upper southeast corner room, the one with the heavy green shutters that are never opened. As a little girl, she was pretty, dark curls, solemn grey eyes, a laugh like bells. People still remember that laugh because they have not heard it since she was 12. That was the year everything changed. No one outside Cypress Grove knows exactly what Catherine saw. They only know that one morning in late summer 1825 she came downstairs covered in blood that was not hers, eyes wide and fixed, mouth open in a scream that had no sound. Silas carried her back upstairs himself. The shutters slammed. The doctors began to arrive. First came the bleeding, cups, lancets, leeches behind the knees, then the purging, calomel, until her gums turned black and her teeth loosened, then the quieting, laudanum by the ounce, morning and night, until her pupil were pinpricks and her hands shook so badly she could no longer hold a teacup. Mercury ointments for the hysteria, blistering plasters, ice baths, restraints. By the time she was 20, Catherine weighed nearly 260 pounds, not from gluttony, but from the swelling that comes when the body is poisoned slowly, deliberately for years. Her skin is pale and damp, her breathing labored. She moves like someone walking underwater. Sometimes, in the dead of night, the whole house shakes with her screams that seem to come from the walls themselves. Once, during one of her fits, she drove a silver letter opener into her father's left hand, clear to the bone. The scar is still there, a pale crescent moon he hides inside kid gloves. Society has its story ready, polished and kind. Poor Silas, burdened with a lunatic daughter. A martyr, really. Such a shame, she was such a pretty child. They say it with the soft cruelty of people who have never been afraid in their own homes. But the house servants know better. They have heard Miss Catherine when the laudanum is thin in her veins. They have heard her whisper names through the floorboards, Pelham, Crenshaw, Fanning, Lyle. They have heard her sob, "I saw what you did in the cellar. I saw you eat her." They keep their mouths shut because to speak is to disappear. Because beneath the polished heart pine floors of Cypress Grove lies a door disguised as pantry wall. Behind that door, narrow stairs descend into damp darkness that smells of rust and old smoke and something sweeter, more rotten. Down there, 13 men in black robes gather when the moon is right. Down there, the brethren of the harvest keep their altar, their ledger, their cups made from skulls. Down there, Silas Rutledge has knelt and sworn and cut and tasted again and again. For 19 years, climbing the invisible ladder one blood-soaked rung at a time. He believes the land itself drinks the offerings. He believes power flows upward through sacrifice. He believes that if he gives enough, one day the great families will have to let him sit at the high table. He is willing to give anything, even his daughter. Catherine was never supposed to see. Children are sent away when the brethren meet. But that night in 1825, the house girl watching her fell asleep. Catherine, small and silent in her nightgown, followed the candlelight down the hidden stairs. She stood in the shadows and watched her father and 12 other men do things that no child should ever have words for. She watched them take a woman, an enslaved woman with no family left to miss her, and open her while she was still breathing. She watched them lift pieces still warm to their mouths. She watched her father drink from a silver cup and smile the same thin smile he would one day use on the veranda when he gave her away. When it was over, Silas found her curled behind the barrels, eyes open, completely silent. He carried her upstairs himself. He told the doctor she had suffered a brain fever. He began the poisoning that same week. 16 years of mercury and laudanum and locked doors. 16 years of telling her gently, relentlessly, that none of it happened, that she dreamed it, that she is sick, that she is mad, that no one will ever believe her. And for 16 years she almost believed him. Almost. Because sometimes, when the dose is a little light, when the trembling stops for an hour or two, Catherine remembers everything with a clarity that burns. She remembers the smell of hot blood on stone. She remembers the sound her father made when he swallowed. She remembers thinking, even at 12 years old, that monsters wear waistcoats and quote scripture. Those are the nights she screams. Those are the nights the house itself seems to scream with her. The enslaved people on Cypress Grove hear it and cross themselves, though they are not supposed to know how. They tell the children to stay away from the big house after dark. They tell each other old stories about houses that drink blood and the river that carries secrets away. They speak softly of the night Miss Catherine will finally come downstairs. Again, not the broken, swollen thing locked in the green-shuttered room, but the girl, with the bells in her laugh, who might still be hiding somewhere inside the ruin. They do not know her rescue is already walking toward them in the shape of a quiet man from Virginia who has not smiled in 3 years. They do not know that the poison is about to stop. They do not know that memory, once it wakes up, is the most dangerous weapon on earth. All they know is that the air has changed. The dogs have stopped barking. The moss hangs heavier than ever, and somewhere deep in the house, behind green shutters that have not opened in a decade, a woman who was told she is mad is beginning to remember that she is not. Welcome to Cypress Grove Plantation. The year is 1841. The moon is waxing, and the harvest is coming. It is the kind of night when even the moon seems ashamed to look down. April 7th, 1841. The big house at Cypress Grove is quiet except for the ticking of the tall case clock in the hall, the soft creak of Silas Rutledge's chair as he rocks back and forth in the lamplight of his study. He has not slept in 2 days. A single letter lies open on the desk in front of him. Thick cream paper, expensive, sealed with blood-red wax impressed by a signet he knows too well, a scythe crossed with stalks of wheat, the mark of the Brethren of the Harvest. Silas has seen that seal on invitations to midnight gatherings, on ledgers stained with things that are not ink, on the inside of his own eyelids when he tries to pray. He has kissed that seal with lips still wet from communion wine. He has sworn oaths beneath it that would make the devil blush. Tonight the seal is not inviting him. It is collecting. The letter is short, polite, and colder than a grave slab. Silas Rutledge is in debt to the Brethren to the amount of $12,000, gambling losses in Charleston, bad rice crops, a failed speculation in cotton futures, money borrowed in secret, interest compounded in secret, now due in full. $12,000 in 1841 is a fortune large enough to buy an entire plantation, slaves included. It is everything Silas has spent 20 years pretending he already possessed. There is no courtroom that will help him. No bank will extend another penny. The Brethren own the judges, the sheriffs, the ministers, the newspapers. They own the air white men breathe in 3 states. The letter offers one path to forgiveness, a demonstration of absolute commitment, a public act that proves Silas places the Brethren above family, above reputation, above God himself. He is to select one of his own slaves, place his daughter Catherine under that slave's total authority for 1 calendar year, and announce it openly to the county as a desperate medical measure for her incurable condition. Not a nurse, not a guardian, a master, a white woman of gentle birth reduced, by her own father's signature, to property of a black man who is already property. The humiliation must be complete, theatrical, unforgettable. It must make Silas Rutledge a pariah among his own kind. Only then will the debt be wiped clean and his seat at the hidden table secured forever. Silas reads the letter 4 times. He pours whiskey but does not drink. He walks the length of the study, back and forth, until the Persian rug shows the path his boots have worn. He thinks of bankruptcy, the auctions, the whispers, the way men like Judge Pelham would smile while buying his silver for pennies. He thinks of disappearing, pistol in the mouth, quick and quiet. He thinks of Catherine upstairs, moaning in drugged dreams, useless, ruined, already half dead. He thinks of the cellar, of the taste of power that lingers on the back of the tongue long after the cup is empty. At 3:17 a.m., he sits down, dips his pen, and writes a single line. I accept the terms. Send me the man. He seals it with his own plain wax no harvest symbol for him tonight, and rings for a houseboy to ride through the dark with it. 3 nights later, the second letter arrives. It contains only a name, an age, a brief description, and the words, he is already on his way. Make the announcement on the 29th. Do not disappoint us again. Silas burns the letter in the hearth and watches the flames eat the name he has not yet spoken aloud. Ezekiel Cross, April 13:41. The sun is barely up, the color of a fresh bruise, when the trader's wagon rolls through the gates. No fanfare, just one man walking behind it in leg irons that clink like slow church bells, led by a white man named Henderson who smells of sour mash and horse sweat. Silas waits on the veranda in his best black coat, hands clasped behind his back so no one will see them shake. The wagon stops. Henderson spits tobacco and grins. "Here's your nigger, Mr. Rutledge. Quiet one. Strong back, good teeth. Your associate said to tell you he was picked special." Silas does not answer. He is staring at the man who has just stepped down into his yard. Ezekiel Cross is 33 years old, 6'2", maybe more. Shoulders like an oak trunk. Skin the deep blue-black of river midnight. His shirt is clean but threadbare. His trousers rolled at the cuffs. There is not a single lash mark on him, unusual, almost unsettling. Most men who have lived 33 years in bondage carry a map of pain across their backs. Ezekiel's skin is unmarked, as though the whip itself was afraid to touch him. But it is the eyes that stop Silas cold. Every enslaved person Silas has ever owned has learned to look at the ground when a white man speaks. It is the first lesson beaten in before the second birthday. Ezekiel Cross looks straight ahead, not defiant, exactly calm, measuring, as though he is the one deciding whether Silas Rutledge is worth the dirt beneath his feet. For one heartbeat, Silas feels something he has not felt in years, fear. Then he remembers who holds the bill of sale and pushes the feeling down. "You understand why you are here?" he asks, voice flat. "Yes, sir," Ezekiel answers. The voice is low, deliberate, with a trace of Virginia tidewater still clinging to the vowels. "I am to care for Miss Catherine." Silas nods once. He does not offer to shake hands. He does not need to. The invisible chain between them is already forged. Henderson unhooks the leg irons, pockets the key with a wink, climbs back on his wagon and is gone. Dust settles. The morning insects begin their soaring again. Silas turns to the shadow that is Ezekiel Cross. "You will live in the small cabin by the smokehouse. You answer to no one but me, and now to my daughter's health. You will begin tomorrow. If she dies, you die. If she worsens, you die slowly. Do we understand each other?" Ezekiel inclines his head just enough. "Yes, sir." Silas waits for more, some flicker of fear, gratitude, anything human, but Ezekiel only stands there, patient as stone. Finally, Silas turns on his heel and walks inside, the screen door slapping shut behind him like a judge's gavel. Ezekiel is left alone in the yard. For the first time since the wagon stopped, he allows his shoulders to drop a fraction. He looks up at the big house, at the green-shuttered window on the second floor, where a shape sometimes moves behind the slats. Then he looks past the house, past the rice fields shimmering with malaria mist, past the river, to a place only he can see. 3 years earlier, on a frostbitten morning in Virginia, Silas Rutledge had stood in a different yard. He had walked between the cabins with a buyer's warrant in his gloved hand, and a smile that never reached his eyes. He had inspected Ezekiel's wife, Sarah, like a broodmare, had pinched the arm of 8-year-old Benjamin and 6-year-old Ruth to test for strength. He had listened to Sarah sing under her breath while she worked, a low hymn that made the overseer nervous. Then he had made his offer, the woman and the 2 children. Not the man. He did not need the man. Ezekiel had begged on his knees in the dust while his children clung to his legs. He had offered to work for free, to take every whipping meant for them anything. Silas had listened politely, then smiled that thin grey smile and said, "I only require the 3. The male is unnecessary." He paid, turned his back, and walked away while Ruth screamed "Papa" until her voice gave out. 18 months later, a trader passing through Alabama brought word fever took the little girl first, then the boy from a cut that turned septic, then Sarah from pure heartbreak. All 3 graves unmarked, bodies dropped in a ditch behind the Gaines plantation like trash. Ezekiel heard the news while splitting firewood in yet another white man's yard. The axe had slipped from his hands and buried itself in the chopping block, so deep it took 3 men to pull it free. That night he began to plan, not with nothing but patience and a hatred so pure it burned cold. He let himself be sold south, then south again, always asking quiet questions, always listening. He learned which white men vanished into the swamps at new moon. He learned the taste of certain rumors, blood, harvest, power. He learned the name Rutledge, spoken in fear by men who feared nothing. When the Brethren's agent finally approached him, in a Richmond slave pen and asked whether he would like to serve a very particular gentleman in South Carolina. Ezekiel had lowered his eyes for the first time in years and whispered, "Yes, master, I would like that very much." Now he stands in the yard that swallowed his family and feels the circle close. He reaches inside his shirt and touches the small cloth bundle sewn against his skin. Inside are 3 strands of hair, one dark and tight coiled from Sarah's head, one soft curl from Ruth's temple the morning they took her, one coarse strand from Benjamin's first haircut. He presses the bundle to his lips once, a kiss no one sees. Then he walks to the little cabin that has been prepared for him, no more than 20 paces from the mistress's window, and begins unpacking the only possessions he owns, a tin cup, a change of shirt, and a folded square of paper on which, in a child's uncertain hand, are written 3 names: Sarah, Benjamin, Ruth. He sets the paper on the windowsill where moonlight can find it. He sits on the narrow cot, and for the first time in 3 years, Ezekiel Cross allows himself the smallest, coldest curve of a smile. He has arrived exactly where he needs to be. Upstairs, behind green shutters, Catherine Rutledge thrashes in a laudanum dream and whispers a single word over and over. A word no one has understood in 16 years, remember. Downstairs, Silas Rutledge pours another whiskey and tells himself the trembling in his hands is only fatigue. Outside, the moss drips like funeral lace, and the river keeps its ancient counsel. 3 lives have just collided in the same house of secrets. One of them is here to heal. One of them is here to pay a debt. One of them is here to watch the world burn. And all 3 of them, without knowing it yet, are already on fire. The harvest has been planted. All that remains is the reaping. The room Catherine had been confined to for most of her adult life seemed smaller now than ever, its walls closing in like the ribs of a beast preparing to swallow her whole. The shutters were nailed, the drapes heavy, the air thick with the scent of laudanum, sweet, cloying and deadly. She lay curled on the narrow bed, a thin blanket tangled around her limbs, barely conscious, drifting in and out of a fog so dense she could no longer distinguish dream from waking nightmare. Silas's footsteps had vanished down the hall hours ago. She had counted them, the way one counts thunder after lightning, waiting for the next flash of agony. She knew his rhythm, the way a prisoner knows the scraping of chains. Tonight his absence only meant another kind of suffering, the forced quiet, the poisoning sleep, the knowledge that her entire world was shrinking to the radius of a single room. So when the door creaked open, when the silhouette filled the doorway, when the floorboard groaned beneath a man's weight, Catherine thought she knew what was coming. The monster never changed his shape. "Please," she whispered, her throat too dry to form a proper plea. Not again. The figure hesitated, a breath, a different type of silence, and then a voice low, unfamiliar, strangely gentle. "Catherine," Ezekiel whispered. "It's me." Her vision blurred, distorted by laudanum and fear. She blinked hard, trying to force his features into focus. She had seen him only twice before, once as a threat, then as a stranger, with a haunted gaze, but nothing about him now matched either memory. His posture, his tone, they held no cruelty, no demand, no ownership. She tried to sit up, but her limbs failed. Her hands shook violently, fingers curling inward, as though the bones inside them had softened. Ezekiel stepped closer, slowly, as though approaching a wounded animal liable to flee or bite. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said. "But what's been done to this?" He lifted the bottle of laudanum from her bedside table. "This is killing you. Killing is the point," she muttered weakly. "It keeps me quiet, keeps me obedient." Ezekiel's jaw tightened. A brief tremor of rage quickly swallowed. "You deserve to be awake," she laughed, or tried to. The sound came out as a dry rattle. "Awake is worse. Not this time." He poured the bottle into the basin, the dark syrup mixing with water, turning it cloudy. The scent rose like a ghost escaping its prison. Catherine's heart hammered with panic. The laudanum was her shield, her chains, her numbness, her entire survival strategy. Without it, every memory, every horror Silas forced upon her would crash back with a clarity sharp enough to draw blood. "Don't," she croaked. "Please." But Ezekiel was resolute. "You've been drugged for 16 years. If you're to have any chance of fighting them, of freeing yourself, you must see clearly." He did the cruelest kindness imaginable. He denied her the oblivion she'd been forced to depend on. The days that followed fell into a kind of living nightmare. Ezekiel stayed with her, sometimes at her bedside, sometimes pacing the small space like a man wrestling with guilt he'd carried since childhood. He brought water, cold cloths, broth she could barely swallow. He wiped her face when she sweated through her dress. He held her hands through tremors that racked her body so violently she feared her bones would shatter. The withdrawal carved her open from the inside. Her teeth chattered uncontrollably. Her skin felt like it crawled with invisible insects. Vomiting came in waves so strong she sometimes lost consciousness. She begged for the tincture, sobbing, cursing him, accusing him of cruelty worse than Silas. But Ezekiel never gave in. He held her eyes with a quiet determination that bordered on anguish. Each time she screamed at him, he took it. Each time she collapsed, he lifted her. At night, fevers brought visions, some memories, some hallucination. She saw Silas's face hovering over her, smiling that thin ecclesiastical smile. She saw her parents' house burning. She saw the rituals in the cellar, men in black coats, the smell of iron and smoke, the chanting that still woke her from nightmares. And sometimes she saw a small boy kneeling at the front pew, trembling while a shadowed figure whispered scripture as punishment. More than once, Ezekiel shook her awake from these terrors, his features stark in the dim candlelight, his shirt damp with sweat from restraining her thrashing. "You're stronger than they believe," he whispered again and again, as though convincing himself. "You survived them. You can survive this." It took 3 weeks, 3 grueling, soul-tearing weeks, before the fog began to lift. And when Catherine finally opened her eyes one morning and found the world sharp, defined, real, she felt as though she had been reborn into someone else's body. She could feel the texture of her sheets, the coolness of the air, the ache in her muscles. She could remember her own name without reaching through honey-thick fog. And Ezekiel was still there, exhausted, unshaven, but present in a way no one had been for her in decades. "You came back," she said softly. "I never left." For a moment, they simply stared at one another, two people hollowed by different storms, yet carrying the same wounds carved by a shared tyrant. Something fragile and profound shifted in the space between them. "Silas," she whispered, voice cracking, "he did this to you too, didn't he?" Ezekiel exhaled, a sound full of years of unspoken torment. "He made me his weapon," he said, "and he made you his possession." "Then we are both prisoners," she answered. "No," Ezekiel said, "not anymore." They spoke for hours. Ezekiel told her what Silas had done to him as a boy, how he had molded him into an instrument of obedience, of purity, of punishment. Catherine told him about the cellar beneath the house, its hidden trapdoor, and what she had seen there before laudanum claimed her memories. Each confession cut deep, yet with each cut they bound themselves tighter together. Not out of affection, though something warm flickered there, but out of necessity. Out of fury, out of a shared desire to expose the monster who had shaped both of their lives. Catherine rose from her bed, legs trembling but determined. "There's something you must see," she said. She led him to the wardrobe, pushed aside a row of dresses, and pressed her hand against the back panel until it shifted slightly. A hidden compartment. Inside were stacks of notebooks, small, weather-worn, wrapped in twine. "Coded journals," she explained. "For years, I wrote everything down. The ceremonies, the names, the dates, the missing children, the bodies buried in the river marsh. They thought the laudanum made me forget." She met his eyes, fierce despite her frailty. "I never forgot. I only hid the remembering." Ezekiel touched the journals as though they were sacred relics. "This is enough to tear the brethren apart." Catherine shook her head. "It's not enough to destroy them. Silas keeps a master ledger, a full accounting of every ritual they performed. It's locked in the cellar. If we steal it, we expose them all." Ezekiel hesitated. "The cellar is heavily guarded." "And the ledger?" "I know where it is," she interrupted, "and I know when it will be unguarded. Silas leaves for Charleston in 2 nights. He stays at the vestry. He never returns early. Never." But Catherine would soon learn that monsters rarely follow their own rules. The night Silas departed, the house felt unnervingly still, as though holding its breath. Catherine dressed in a plain cloak, hiding the frailty still lingering in her limbs. Ezekiel carried only a candle and a small leather satchel. They slipped through the kitchen, down a narrow hallway, to the door no servant ever touched. Catherine's fingers brushed the hidden latch beneath the floorboard, and the trapdoor groaned open. A wave of cold, fetid air rose from below earth. Mildew. Something darker. "Are you certain?" Ezekiel whispered. She nodded. "I've been certain for years." They descended the narrow stairs into the darkness. Catherine's pulse quickened as childhood memories clawed at her. The chanting, the screams, the smell of burning tallow, the metallic tang of blood on stone. Ezekiel stayed close, his candle casting tall shadows that leapt across the walls like skeletal figures. At the bottom, the chamber stretched before them, larger than Ezekiel expected, carved directly into the foundation of the house. Racks of ritual objects lined the walls: iron hooks, ceremonial knives, bowls stained with old offerings. Catherine forced her gaze to remain steady. "There," she pointed. "The ledger is kept inside that cabinet." Ezekiel opened it with a thin metal tool, and inside rested the thick, leather-bound tome, its spine cracked, its pages yellowed, its contents damning. They set it upon the central table and opened it. The candlelight flickered over page after page of horrors, lists of names, ages, dates, descriptions of purifications and offerings, codes that Catherine deciphered on sight. Together, they worked feverishly, Ezekiel copying the entries into her journals, Catherine whispering translations of the coded terms. Hours passed. The candle burned low. Sweat gathered on Catherine's brow despite the cold. "We're nearly done," Ezekiel murmured. "Just one more page." A noise interrupted him. A footstep. The unmistakable creak of the cellar door. Catherine froze. Ezekiel blew out the candle instantly, plunging them into pitch darkness. Another footstep, slow, measured. Familiar. Silas. He should have been in Charleston, should have been miles away. But Silas Holloway was never predictable, never merciful. His voice drifted into the chamber like smoke. "Catherine, Ezekiel," a terrifying calm. "As I expected," he said softly. "Rats will always return to the place they were bred." Ezekiel seized Catherine's hand, but there was nowhere left to run. And Silas was already descending the stairs. The storm arrived long before the clouds did. It entered the room as a voice, smooth, cold, deliberate, curling around Ezekiel like a serpent made of silk and venom. Silas Lockwood stood in the doorway of the abandoned chapel, hands folded neatly behind his back as though he were greeting a guest rather than confronting a man who had dared to trespass in forbidden shadows. The moon poured through the broken windows, carving sealers into a tall obsidian silhouette. Ezekiel did not bow. He didn't kneel. He didn't look away. For the first time in his life, he met Silas Lockwood as an equal, though both knew the cost of that boldness. Silas smiled without warmth. "Ezekiel," he said, "you've done what no man of your station has ever done. You survived the brethren's suspicion and even earned its interest." He paced slowly, circling him, the way a wolf circles the one deer brave enough to stop running. "But your trespass cannot go unanswered," Silas murmured, "and yet perhaps it can be redirected." Ezekiel felt the trap tightening before the words even formed. Silas leaned in, breath papery and perfumed with wine. "I offer you a choice. Serve us. Become our associate." A pause, heavy with hidden meaning. "And in exchange, the brethren will help you destroy the man who truly worked your family to death." The words struck Ezekiel harder than any blow. Silas knew. He knew every detail, every pain, every corpse in Ezekiel's past, because he had put many of them there. "And if I refuse?" Ezekiel asked. Silas didn't blink. "Then you die tonight, and Catherine dies with you." The room fell still. Even the insects, even the wind, seemed to pause and await his answer. At last Ezekiel bowed his head, not in submission but in calculation. "I accept." Silas smiled, satisfied. But in that moment Ezekiel made a vow deep in the hollow of his chest: "I will burn every one of you." And he would. They took Catherine away the next morning, telling Ezekiel she was being escorted to safety in Philadelphia. The carriage door shut softly, almost lovingly. Silas placed a hand on Ezekiel's shoulder. "Now you may serve with a clear mind." What Silas didn't know, what none of the brethren knew, was that Catherine never crossed the property line. Hours after the carriage rolled away, she slipped out of a false bottom in the wagon. Barefoot, half-starved, but sharper of mind than she had been in 2 decades, she hid in the slave quarters, moving silently from room to room after dark. It took her only a week to gather whispers, 2 weeks to earn trust, 3 weeks to spark a flame. These were the forgotten ones, men and women beaten by the brethren, mothers who lost children to ritual illness, husbands who buried wives who went missing. Grief hung around them like the humid air of the marshes. When Catherine told them the truth, the cannibalistic rites, the cellar altar, the ledger, they didn't question her. They had always known their masters worshipped something darker than God. She became their ghost leader, appearing only in shadows, face high, hidden under a shawl, her voice trembling but her resolve iron. They began to watch, to wait, to prepare. For the first time in 20 years, Catherine felt her soul rebuilding itself, not because she believed she would survive, but because she believed others might. 3 weeks after his acceptance, Ezekiel was summoned. "Tonight you become one of us," Silas said. They placed a blindfold over Ezekiel's eyes, thick, masculine cloth tied tight enough to hurt. He let them lead him, counting each step, each turn, memorizing every shift in the air. Down the hall, down another, left, right, then down, down again. The scent changed. Damp stone, cold earth, candle wax melting in stale air, the cellar. He heard the scrape of boots. The chitter of excitement in men trying to mask their hunger. The blindfold was removed. The sight hit him like a blow. Candlelight flickered across the room, casting distorted shadows on walls stained with years of blood. 13 hooded figures stood in a circle, faces half lit, half devoured by darkness. On the altar lay a girl 15 at most, wrists and ankles bound, eyes swollen from crying. Ezekiel knew that terror intimately. Silas stepped forward, holding a ceremonial knife with a bone handle, carved into a pattern of twisting vines. "Tonight," Silas said softly, "you prove yourself. 1 cut is all it takes." He offered the knife. Ezekiel took it. The girl trembled violently. Tears slid in silent streams down her cheeks. Ezekiel raised the blade, and then he pivoted. The closest Brethren member didn't even gasp before the blade slid across his throat, spilling a sheet of red across the altar. For a long heartbeat, the room froze. Then the screaming began. Catherine had waited for the signal, the first scream. At the sound, she and 23 others surged from the shadows of the slave quarter. Armed with whatever their hands had found, axes, hatchets, fire pokers, rusty scythes, they ran toward the cellar entrance, feet pounding, torches blazing, a human storm breaking loose. When they burst down the stairs, the sight before them ignited every buried agony into a flame hotter than hell. Silas shouted for order, for discipline, for loyalty, but none of those words had ever applied to the men charging toward him with murder in their throats. The cellar became a slaughterhouse. One by one, the Brethren fell, some fighting, some begging, some clawing for escape through walls that had no doors. Ezekiel fought like a man who had already died once. Catherine fought like a woman who had been dead for 20 years and had finally awakened. 13 men who believed themselves gods learned in their last gasping moments that even gods can bleed. By dawn, the house was an inferno. Flames crawled up the walls like blazing serpents, devouring portraits, tapestries, ledgers, and secrets. The screams had stopped an hour ago. Catherine and Ezekiel stood outside the burning mansion, the orange glow flickering across soot-streaked faces. "Is it over?" Catherine whispered. "No," Ezekiel said, "but this part is." Behind them, the freed men and women gathered in a silent circle, watching the structure that had enslaved them and buried their families collapse into itself. Some cried, some stood blankly, some held each other. All were free. But freedom had come with a cost they would carry forever. They had saved only one thing from the flames, the ledger. It was wrapped in cloth, tied with rope. Inside were handwritten records, dates, names, sacrifices, buyers, allies, donors, blood rights, and horrors that could bring down half the South. Catherine held it in trembling hands. "Should we give it to someone?" she asked. Ezekiel shook his head slowly. No one would believe it, and the ones who might would kill to bury it deeper. The truth was too dangerous to speak, too poisonous to reveal. Some truths, once exposed, do not free the world, they burn it. Catherine gently closed the ledger. "We can't carry this together," she whispered. "I know," Ezekiel replied. The sun was rising, softening the world into gold instead of fire. Birds began to sing. It felt wrong. Catherine turned to Ezekiel. Her face was tired, lined, aged by years of pain, but her eyes were bright, live, almost young again. "Where will you go?" she asked quietly. "West," he said. "As far as the land goes. And you?" "North. I have family I haven't seen since I was stolen as a girl." A long silence stretched between them. "You saved me," Catherine whispered. Ezekiel shook his head. "No, you saved yourself. I was just there to help you remember." She smiled at that. They stood for a moment longer, watching the smoke curl toward the sky like dark prayers rising. Then, without ceremony, without farewell, without promises they knew they couldn't keep, they walked in opposite directions. Ezekiel did not look back. Catherine did not stop. Between them lay the ashes of Cypress Grove, the last home of the Brethren, the last altar, the last sacrifice. Behind them lay the truth, a truth that would never be spoken, ever recorded, never believed. Ahead of them lay the rest of their lives. For the first time, they belonged only to themselves.